and do this. All right, I think we're off. So thank you everyone for joining. What I will try to do is tell you a little bit more about ex-situ management for conservation in general, but particularly in the context of the guidelines for IUCN that help you to decide if and when and what form of ex-situ management you might consider incorporating into the species conservation plan that you may be developing for the species that you work with. So I don't need to tell you all that amphibians, like many other species, are in trouble, and that there is a high proportion of threatened species. And so in order to save those species and make sure they regain a more healthy status in the wild, we need to come up with a whole host of conservation strategies. And the main thing I would like to do with this presentation is to show you that the toolkit that we usually think of when we consider coming up with conservation strategies for our threatened species may contain more tools than you think. So usually the first things we think about to save threatened species are strategies that help counteract the big threats that humans have put out there in nature. And so we might think about land use policies or water management or monitoring research, restoring connectivity between habitats, stricter law enforcement, etc. But you may find that your conservation toolkit, so to speak, has a second compartment down the bottom, where we find a number of tools that help us to do intensive management of populations. And that can be both in situ, but also ex situ. And I think the amphibian community is much more aware than others of this second, often hidden layer, because the crisis is so intense for a number of amphibian species. And so the idea of ex-situ conservation is less foreign to your community, I think, than many others. I do think, though, that it may be good to point out to you, hopefully in the course of the presentation, that you may have a much more diverse set of tools in that second layer of your toolkit than you may be aware. We often very quickly jump to the strategy of breed for release when we think about ex-situ management, and that's of course a very important strategy, but it's only one of a whole host of options. So hopefully this presentation will help to give you a better idea of that. Before I jump into that, I just want to remind you of how the threat process often works for threatened species, and therefore where in this process we need to intervene to stop them from going extinct and indeed recover to a better situation. So what often happens is that species face a whole number of what we call primary threats, often caused by humans. There are things like habitat loss, water pollution, invasive species, things like that. And they cause the populations to decline. And when that continues, they become small and fragmented. Once they're at that stage, there is a second set of threats that comes into play whether you like it or not. We call those stochastic threats or random threats. And they are things like just normal random variation in birth and death rates. You can have a few years with almost all females born, or a few years of high adult female mortality. There are things like catastrophes that can involve disease epidemics, etc. And once populations are small and fragmented, they start to struggle with low genetic variation and inbreeding effects. So these factors, these secondary threats, start to work on the population and are going to reduce reproduction and survival even further. And so your population can get into what we call the extinction vortex. Once it's in that stage, even if you somehow magically were to be able to get rid of the primary threats, your species might still go extinct because it cannot get out of this series of secondary threats that is building on top of each other. And so unless this is addressed correctly, the species can first go extinct in the wild, and if you have none in ex-situ situations, the species can go completely extinct. So often when we think about, or better said, when we think about conservation strategies, or when we're developing conservation strategies for threatened species, we immediately jump into trying to identify management actions that address these big primary threats. And so we'll try to restore habitats, reduce offtake through poaching or remove invasive species, etc. And those things are, of course, hugely important. But we must remember that small populations may actually go extinct while you were trying to fix these bigger problems. They're often quite complicated. They involve lots of different human stakeholders and often take a long time to remedy. And so if a population is already in this extinction vortex, you may find you have very little to recover once your primary threats have been addressed. At the same time, if you were to focus all your attention on the secondary threats, on the stochastic threats, and so you spend all your attention trying to crank up reproduction or add animals from ex-situ populations, trying to very intensively track individuals to improve their survival and so on, you may find that your population is always going to remain small and vulnerable, because no matter what you do, you haven't addressed those primary threats. And so every time your population recovers a bit, it's going to be knocked back down through those primary threats. So no big surprise, small populations often need us to work at both ends, need us to work both on the primary threats and try and do something about the fact that they're dealing with small populations that are fragmented and that have problems with reproduction and or survival. So when we think about our conservation toolbox again, then we need to make sure that we've got tools in there that can address all of these levels that a threatened species may be facing, and we shouldn't forget one level or the other. And we may well need to use the correct tool out of all the different layers of our toolbox. So we do need things like, well, anti-poaching things, invasive species control, land use policies, and so on. But we also need a whole range of tools to help with intensive management of individuals and populations. Part of that can happen in situ, like a translocation, or indeed assisting individuals in situ. And then there's a whole host of ex-situ activities that I'm of course going to tell you much more about. So I'm not going to say very much about the one plan approach because Bob Lacey is going to talk for a whole hour after this. So this is the only slide I'll use. But just to help put the ex-situ guidelines into context, what we ideally would like to see is that the in-situ conservation community and the ex-situ conservation community together makes one integrated species conservation strategy. And that strategy contains all the management strategies and actions that are needed to conserve the species in situ. So the complete toolbox that's necessary, or the complete set of tools out of the toolbox that's necessary to save the species. And where appropriate, that may include intensive management of individuals and populations. And again, where appropriate, that may include ex-situ management. And so that whole package has to have the goal to have a viable in situ population. And it's really in this spirit that the IUCN guidelines on the use of ex-situ management for species conservation were written. So they are written to help teams of conservationists to evaluate where it might be appropriate to use ex-situ management and what type of ex-situ management for what purpose exactly. So the guidelines help you evaluate if ex-situ activities should be established and what then the structure should be of those ex-situ programs. So by the time you've kind of run through the process in the guidelines, you will have, if the answer is yes, we want ex-situ management, you will have effectively built the structure of your program at the same time. That's quite handy. It provides a transparent and structured decision process. And that's important because you want to be able to explain to others why you're doing what you are doing, but you also want to be able to explain to yourself 10 years from now why you did what you did. And we often have to think back and say, why did we do this exactly? Why did we make that decision? You know, people move on to other jobs. The world changes around us. So it's really important to have a moment in time where we have a clear description of what we decided and why. The guidelines are applicable whether or not the species is already held in ex-situ circumstances. So whether you're starting from scratch or you already have some individuals or biological tissue ex-situ. And you can apply them to all taxa and all living forms. There's no reason why you can't use them for amphibians, and indeed you should. And they're available in multiple languages. You can find them on the IUCN website and the CPSG website. And if you Google them, you'll immediately find which languages are currently available. But I think there's at least 5 or 6, including Spanish and Portuguese. And I think Russian and German, but after that, I'm no longer certain. What is relevant, of course, for you is that the amphibian ARC conservation needs assessment process, which existed before the guidelines existed, was a very important source of inspiration for us. For those of you that have been involved with your conservation needs assessments, you know that there is an element of this type of evaluation in the overall conservation needs assessment. And so that was very valuable for us, and it's important for you to know that again, very smoothly translates into the guidelines. So the guidelines are not something completely different than is in the conservation needs assessment. There are some tweaks, and I think there's a bit more depth in some areas, but they're certainly not incompatible with each other. Okay, the crux of the guidelines is that it has a 5-step decision-making process, and I'm going to go through each step in turn with an example or two, but just as an overview, first of all, we encourage people to, of course, review the threats and the current status of wild and any existing ex-situ populations, to then carefully think about potential ex-situ conservation roles that could address constraints on the species' viability. Then say, okay, if this is what I want ex-situ management to achieve for the species, what should that program look like in order to fulfill those conservation roles? Once you know what it needs to look like, then you can get a rough idea of the scale or the type of resources that you're going to need to set up such a program, and a rough idea of what may be the risks or the feasibility of doing this. And then based on that previous analysis, you can make a decision regarding whether or not you're going to go ahead with any ex-situ activities, and what they're going to look like and what the exact purpose is going to be. So this is not nuclear physics. I think it's a fairly logical process, and it sounds even a bit ridiculously simple, but it is amazing how quickly we as humans like to jump into steps 3 and 4 and start developing a program without having really carefully considered what the current situation is for that species and what exactly that ex-situ program needs to do. I think it's very important not to skip those steps, even if you think you are confident that you know what you're doing. Certainly when you work with partners, it's important that everybody has the same idea of what you will be doing. So let's have a look at each one of those steps in turn. And the first step is to review the threats and the current status of wild and captive populations, which is fairly self-evident, I would think. And I apologize for the orangutan slide. I didn't have time to go make an amphibian version of this. But basically, you want to make sure that whatever information is out there regarding the in-situ status of the species, that you gather that and have that clearly in your head. So that can be, of course, red list assessments, action plans that may already exist. Sometimes they can be a species can be part of national action plans that are multi-species. Conservation strategies for areas or species, reports from various entities, publications, relevant specialist groups, and etc. So think widely enough and go hunt for existing information and overall conservation planning recommendations that may or may not exist for your species. It's equally important, of course, to know what does not exist. In that context, it's important to go further than just check, for example, what the red list status is for a species, whether that's the international red list status or your national red list status. Because just knowing that a species is threatened in what category only gives you a limited amount of information in order to really know where ex-situ management might be able to help the species. You need to have a better understanding of the actual threat process that is working on that species. So think of those earlier slides. What exactly are the primary threats and how are they working on the species? How quickly are they likely to drive the species down? Is the species already quite in tough situations in terms of small populations and fragmentation, etc. So you want to have a sufficiently detailed understanding of what the threat situation is of the species. Once you've surveyed the in-situ status of the species and what conservation actions may already have been recommended for the species, then you also want to have a look at what the status is of any ex-situ populations. And there's a whole set of sources that are available for certainly mammals and birds, maybe less so for amphibians, but you may have your own sources of information. Zoo and aquarium associations, the ZIMS database, Zoological Information Management System database. Sometimes facility surveys among ex-situ facilities. There may be universities or rescue centers that have some individuals of the species or groups of the species or have a good chance of having some. Don't forget cryobanks, depending on how relevant or large scale they are for amphibians at the minute. So whatever the source is that is most relevant for your taxa, try to get a good overview of what may or may not be present in ex-situ situations. And sometimes you can get a lot very detailed information, and sometimes you may not get more than there are some groups of these species in that center, but whatever you can get is relevant to know. So once you have reviewed the in-situ and ex-situ status and have a good idea of what the threat process for the species looks like, Then the second step in the guidelines encourage you to define the potential ex-situ conservation roles to help the species. And it's really important to spend enough time on this because breed for release, which is often the option we readily jump to, is a good option, but it's just one of quite a number of options. And so you want to make sure they're making the right choices. And so you want to assess and determine these roles carefully. In order to do that, it's good to keep in mind that ex-situ activity can help in a threat situation in basically 4 different ways. And the first way that ex-situ activities can help is by addressing the causes of those primary threats. So those big things that are driving the species down in the first place. The threats like habitat loss and disease and invasive species, etc. And sometimes there are ex-situ activities that you can do to address some of those threats. They can be specific research or training and education, or fill in important data gaps. So an obvious one for amphibians to keep in mind when you're thinking about potential ex-situ activities of this category is amphibians that are kept ex-situ to help research the threat of chytrid fungus of various sorts in various types and groups of amphibians. And so these populations may be held maybe in university laboratories rather than ex-situ breeding centers. They may not be breeding them. They may totally be focused on disease epidemiology and treatment, etc. But that's still an ex-situ management for conservation, because without getting a grip on the disease dynamics, you have a hard time saving those species. So even small populations in what we don't classically may think of as conservation ex-situ facilities can still have a very important ex-situ conservation role. And when we think about education, sometimes we jump to the conclusion that's a more indirect way to help conservation of certain species. But depending on what the problem is that you're trying to address with education and where the audience is that you need to get to, you may still have a very direct way of influencing behavior of people and really address the primary threats of those species. So just an example from the vulture world. In Europe, like in most continents these days where their vultures occur, they suffer from poisoning. And there are various types of poisoning. It can be through poison that's put out by the farmers to discourage terrestrial predators, but of course the vultures pick that up too. It can be indirectly through the treatment of livestock with a veterinary product called diclofenac. But when those sheep or goats die in the field and the vultures eat them, it is lethal for them. And eating of poisoned rodents and so on. And so in Europe, for example, the zoos, public zoos that have vultures and are in the areas where the vultures occur and the poisoning occurs, get through their gates the people that are involved in the poisoning, whether they deliberately target vultures or not. And so they can, through carefully set up education and awareness changing campaigns, do get to those to the right audience and influence that primary threat. So influencing primary threats with ex-situ management is rare, but it's not impossible. And I think certainly in the amphibian world, there may be a host of ways that could play a role. Then the second way that ex-situ activities can help in a threat situation is to offset the effects of threats on the population. So to think really carefully, what is happening to my species, to population size, population growth or lack thereof, to reproduction, which phase of reproduction is affected, what's happening to survival, which life stage is being affected, is there inbreeding and inbreeding depression, etc. And what can I do through ex-situ management to counteract some of those effects? So here's again some obvious examples from the amphibian world. Is our head starting programs, and here's our European colleagues from Northern Zark working with the Swedish green toad, whereby the wild eggs and tadpoles are eaten by introduced fish and crayfish. And so just one arm, let's say, of the conservation strategy for this species, or the Swedish population of the species, is to collect egg strings. I'm sure you have a better word for that, but bear with a mammal person. Let's say egg strings are collected from the wild, and they're hatched and raised ex-situ until a certain stage, and then they're released as small toads. So it's a case where no captive breeding is required, and animals are just reared in captivity and then released back when they are past a life stage where they have a problem. So that would be one way of offsetting the effect of a particular threat on, in this case, survival in a particular life stage. Then, of course, we can use ex-situ management to help restore wild populations through population reinforcement or reintroduction, but also increasingly we may want to think about assisted colonization when the original range that they were in is no longer available or is changing. And some species have been used for ecological replacement, so to go and fulfill an ecological function in an area where the original species that held that ecological function is extinct. And that's happened with some of the tortoise species, and maybe, who knows, maybe relevant for some of the amphibians. So restoring wild populations, I think that's pretty obvious to you, the types of things or types of examples that fit into that category. And okay, this is a wolf, but you'll have lots of amphibian examples where, in this case, wild populations of Mexican wolf were being reestablished from ex-situ populations. And there's still ongoing releases to reinforce the population by cross-fostering captive-born pups into wild litters. So you may well start with reintroduction, but then need to continue with reinforcement and so on. And then finally, a way that ex-situ management can help is by what we call buy time. So these are populations that allow you to keep the species on the planet while you figure out some bigger problems higher up in the chain, or instances in which you have to rescue them from impending doom. Some examples of the buying time category are, for example, insurance populations. So they can be consisting of living individuals and or frozen materials, so frozen gametes or living tissue that's being banked in an appropriate way. So that allows you to preserve both individuals and the species gene diversity, and can be an insurance against species extinction. And of course, this role also makes possible some other roles for ex-situ management, like research, and then later reinforcement and restoration. Pure insurance populations are often poo-pooed a bit because the use of a lot of insurance populations is measured against whether or not they've been used for reintroduction. And that is maybe a little bit of a dangerous way of looking at it, because you don't, the very definition of insurance is that you don't need it until disaster strikes. So whether or not disaster did strike in your particular instance is not a very good way of assessing insurance. It's a probability issue. And so a way to illustrate that is perhaps with the golden lion tamarins, famous conservation success story, where that species was brought back from 200 individuals in the 1980s until 3,700 a couple of years ago. And part of that recovery was through reintroduction of captive-born individuals. And then reintroduction stopped because the right number of animals and the right genes had been brought back to the wild, and the species was growing. And about 1/3 of the wild population was derived from captive-born animals. And we had a reasonably hard time to keep convincing various stakeholder groups that we still needed to look after our big global insurance population, because there were no planned reintroductions anymore. And so there was this general feeling of we're done. But we knew that with only 3,700, we still needed that insurance, considering that there's still a lot of pressures and continuously new threats working on those populations in a small distribution area. And then about two years ago, yellow fever poked up its head, and we lost 1/3 of the wild population. And so suddenly then the insurance role is seen to be indeed valuable. So not everything needs insurance, but also don't automatically dismiss it if you don't have immediate reintroduction plans. Think about whether there is a serious reason for concern and the probability that some disaster may strike your population, and knock it down enough that you might need individuals from captivity, or indeed genes from captivity, to top up your wild gene population may be necessary. Rescue, your amphibian people are well aware of that with the chytrid fungus. You've had to rescue a number of amphibian species, and have been able to follow chytrid disease waves across the landscape, and had to go and grab some of those species before they got hit. It's not only amphibians that deal with that. The same was the case for the Tasmanian devils and the Tasmanian facial tumor disease. And so at least a subset of the population in captivity was a rescue population in face of a very acute emerging threat. So rescue is definitely an ex-situ conservation role. And then the last one in this category is also well known to you, sadly. An example here is the Kihansi spray toad, when it was indeed extinct, or certainly functionally extinct in the wild. So once in a situation where you only have individuals in captivity left, and there's none left in the wild, then you have an ARC population. And it can seem a bit academic to talk about, is it an ARC population or is it a rescue population? But certainly knowing that you're holding the last ones of the species and there's nothing left in the wild helps focus the mind. It does create an extra bit of urgency and importance, so it can help to label it as an ARC population, just to keep everybody on their toes. Okay, so the message for step number 2 is spend enough attention thinking exactly where in the threat process you're going to try and help the species, and therefore what exactly the role is of your ex-situ population. And you may well have more than one role, they're not always mutually exclusive, They may also be consecutive. So you may start with one followed by another, etc. But it's really good to think about those different roles carefully enough. Once you know what you want to do for the species, then you can start to think about what the characteristics are of that ex-situ program. And so you would have to think about things like the scope. Is it going to be very regional or national or international? Will the animals be held off display, or do they need to be on exhibit? What number of types of facilities do you need? In your case, do you need biosecurity and so on? What type of husbandry and expertise do you need? And you may also want to think a little bit, at least in terms of scale, as to what numbers of animals you will need, or numbers of groups, as the case may be. Desired growth rate of your population, roughly the number of founders needed. Is it an open or closed population? Meaning, are you still going to get animals in from the wild or not? What level of or intensity of genetic management do you need or can you do with your life history? What is the length of the program? Are you planning this? Are you planning to do this program for 10 years and then you're done, or is the species going to be in captivity for a longer term, etc. And there are a number of population management and modeling tools that can help you with that. I'm going to say very little about it because I know Bob is going to say more. So if you want to hear about those tools, stay online for the next talk. But if you're interested, you can, and you're not online next hour, you can find them at the website scti.tools. But they can help you with certainly some of the numerical decisions. And then, of course, you also have a whole host of Amphibian ARC guidelines that can help you with some of those decisions, or at least get a first idea, like population management guidelines, but you have husbandry guidelines, etc. Population viability models that are designed for wild populations. Light vortex can also give you an idea to look at the viability of in situ populations on the current conditions and on the various types of management strategies that you may be considering. And so they can help you model the effect of the release of ex situ animals on the wild population, etc. So again, there are some models that can help you make evaluations as to which strategies may be better than others, or maybe have a higher chance of feasibility. And speaking of feasibility, once you have a rough idea of the roles you want to achieve and what type of program you need to achieve that, then you can start to think about what are the resources that I need to implement this. What are maybe some of the risks associated with this, and how big are they, and what is the overall feasibility of us building such a program in a successful way. And so again, the guidelines give you lots of guidance in this, but basically you want to think about resources and feasibility in kind of different topic areas. One is biological feasibility. Things like, can I get enough founder individuals? Do I have the existing expertise with this species or model species, both for the ex situ phase, but also for the capture, for the release, etc. What is the social feasibility in terms of existing plans and governing agencies, legislation, permitting, stakeholder issues, organizational aspects, etc. Resources, of course, in terms of staff and financing, and then what is the likelihood of success. So you want to think about some elements of risk assessment. What is the risk to the source population viability if we set up this program? What's the risk to the recipient population if we bring animals back? Disease and parasite risks. There may be political, social, or public conflicts. And you don't want to forget to think about the likely future of the wild population if you were not to do your ex situ activities. So it's often to think about the risks of doing your ex-situ population, but also you want to think of the risk if you don't step in this way. And then number 5, the fun part, is after that analysis, you hopefully have more of a basis to make a decision as to whether ex-situ activity should be established and for what purpose. And here, to put it in a very simple way, it's a case of weighing the likely conservation benefits against the risk and the feasibility. And so I read in some of the symposium descriptions what you do with surplus animals. So you may have, for some species, you may have surplus animals ex situ that you could very well release. And so that part of the project is very feasible because you already have your individuals in hand, so to speak. But then it's a case of, okay, where in the threat process of the species in situ can these released individuals help? And is that the right place? And will they help in the right way? And so, in other words, does the benefit outweigh the risk? Because every release has risks. And so we want to make sure that if we do a release, that the risks and the feasibility are in balance with the conservation benefit. So if the benefit is huge, then you might accept a bigger risk or bigger or a more difficult program. Whereas if the conservation benefit is more like, it might also help, then you don't want to tolerate a lot of risk. And you may have to find other solutions for your surplus animals. So it still helps to go through that process and try to think almost as if you didn't have the animals you already have. What does the species need and how is it best helped? So you generally want the benefits to be bigger than the risks. And again, a number of models can help you make some of those decisions by weighing one option against another. And then it's very good to be transparent about your decision. So write down all the evaluations and the thought process that you went through in the previous step and why you're making the decision that you are making, and make sure that that whole process is part of an action plan and is also stored and publicly available, so that 15 years from now it is clear why that particular step was or was not taken. So to go back to our toolkit, as you already know, in the amphibian world, there is a second department in our conservation toolkit where we have ex-situ management tools. Just be aware that there's a large variety of tools in there, and you want to choose carefully which tools you'll use. And also, it's not because you have the tool that you must use it. So you want to evaluate carefully when you should use any of those tools and which ones. Okay, so that's some of the theory. How can we do this in practice in the context of conservation planning? It can be done as part of a species conservation planning workshop, where often you'll have different groups working on different aspects of a species conservation strategy. So you might have a biological population working group and a habitat issues working group and an ex-situ management working group that effectively is stepping through the guidelines in the course of the workshop and keep feeding back with the rest of the conservation plan to make sure that any ex-situ activities that are being recommended are indeed necessary if you look at the whole conservation strategy for the species, and are also complementary and don't counteract any of the other decisions that are being made for the species. One can also have a separate but related to the overall conservation plan ex-situ conservation needs assessment workshop. An example here was for 2 threatened butterflies in North America. So they had the overall conservation plan for these species that said that there was a likely need for ex-situ management, and then there was a smaller group of people going through the ex-situ conservation needs assessment, and they came up with a whole series of of steps because it was not yet clear at that time how these species should be managed. So they were going to start with a head starting role. They were confident they could rear eggs. At the same time, start breeding, looking into breeding research for the surrogate species. Once you can do that, you can step to an insurance population with a relevant species. Then you can use some of those animals for parasite and disease research. You can use them for reinforcement reestablishment. And at the same time, they had some trigger points. For example, at what stage will we go in and rescue some of the wild population? What are some of the signals that we would be looking for to decide to have an emergency action in there and start a rescue population? If you have a separate ex-situ planning workshop, it's crucial that that always remains a component part of the overall plan. So this was for the Edwards pheasant, or now called Vietnam pheasant. You have the overall national action plan, a number of individuals that were part of this plan, plus a bigger group of ex-situ specialists deal with detailed planning for the ex-situ components, for the characteristics, feasibility, and so on. And that then has to be fed back into the overall species conservation plan. So they can't be separate entities. And Bob will talk more about that in the next presentation. You can also do these ex-situ needs assessments for several species at a go. CPSG was involved for 7 Brazilian bird species. Of course, the more species you do in a shorter amount of time, the less detail you can put in each of the steps, but you can still go through those steps and make higher level decisions that then later can be looked at in more detail. And that, of course, is well known to you because you have the amphibian art conservation needs assessments processes that indeed have elements of highlighting potential ex-situ management roles. So I think the two processes of the amphibian conservation needs assessment and the IUCN guidelines are certainly complementary. We also have a process, but I'm going to be quick on that because we want to leave some time for questions maybe. We have a process in for zoos and aquarium associations where we have applied the guidelines to do multi-species, very quick ex-situ conservation assessments based on the process in the guidelines, but to help make zoo managers decide which species and populations they should focus on in their zoo regions. So this was particularly designed for zoo and aquarium collection planning. Very briefly, before the workshop, we would gather all the information that is in steps 1 and 2, 1 of the guidelines, so the in-situ and ex-situ status, existing recommendations, threat process, etc. And then at the workshop, we go through the steps in the guidelines to look at things like what are the roles we're thinking of, what would be the benefit, what's the feasibility, what's the risk, and take much more notes than we would put in this table, but it nevertheless helps us decide what species we should focus on in zoo associations and what their role should be. And again, it's very important that this exercise is done by both in situ and ex situ conservation colleagues together. So this has been done a number of times now. For example, for 40 species from Taiwan, including, and for 62 turtle species in addition to that, and 2 days for each. And in IASA, because the ICAP process and the IASA collection planning process were developed at the same time with a big overlap in people, we effectively have an RCP process that is pretty much the same as an ICAP process. And so all of our taxon advisory groups will go through this, and we've done a number, including for terrestrial invertebrates. We've done some chelonians, and we'll be doing a first set of fish this year. So again, it can be done for bigger groups. You just need a bigger pre-selection before you go into the workshop, because you cannot do this detailed analysis for all terrestrial invertebrates. That's self-evident. So in terms of ex-situ conservation assessment options, we think that it should be an explicit component of species conservation planning. It is a potential tool in the toolbox. It's not because you have the tool that you have to use it, but just be aware that you have it. This provides an independent process integrated with other conservation planning. You can have multi-species assessments for related taxa with less detailed planning. And you can also have very multi-species rapid assessments in only a very general level that you would then later take up in more detail for individual species that you think need more attention.